African leaders gather in Delhi as India seeks to gain access to Africa's natural resources. But what does India have to offer Africa, and who stands to gain most from any deals? And can Delhi fight China's growing influence on the continent? This is Inside Story. Hello, I'm Darren Jordan. Well, India has welcomed delegates from more than a dozen African nations to a summit in Delhi. Why? To improve a relationship that both Indians and Africans hope will prove groundbreaking. India's Prime Minister Manmohan Singh outlined just how powerful their partnership could be.
The time has come to create a new architecture for our engagement in the 21st century. We visualize a partnership that is anchored in the fundamental principles of equality, mutual respect, and mutual benefit. Working together, the 2 billion people of India and Africa can set an example of fruitful cooperation in the developing world.
Well, in the last 10 years, India has moved from a sluggish developing nation to a global economic success story. And this week, it's offering help to some of Africa's poorest nations to boost their development. So what can Africa offer India? Well, India hopes Africa can provide the energy to fuel its booming economy. But India has to compete for Africa's attention. China wants to strengthen its trade ties in Africa that are already worth more than $55 billion a year. Well, joining us now are our guests in Delhi, Dr. Suresh Kumar, Assistant Professor at the Department of African Studies at the University of Delhi. In Johannesburg, Noima Grobelaar, Director of Research at the South African Institute of International Research. And in London, Anthony Goldman, Deputy Editor of Africa Asia Confidential. Welcome to the programme, all of you. Dr. Anthony Goldman in London, let me start with you first, if I may. How important is this conference to India, and what sort of message is Delhi trying to send out to African nations, do you think?
No, I think it's very important. There has been a relationship between India and Africa for decades, but I think there's been a perception that, at least at the government level in India, they've been lagging behind what's been an increasingly competitive environment between other Asian countries and more traditional trading partners in Europe and America for some of Africa's resources. And I think there's also a perception that actually India perhaps really has got something to offer Africa, and that now is a good time to be showcasing that. So I think that in many ways a lot of things have come together to make this a very good moment for India to look to build its relationship with the African continent.
Well, let's just bring in one of those African countries now and talk to Noima Grobelaar from Johannesburg. Noima, how do African countries view India's attempts to woo them, and who stands to gain most from this partnership?
Well, I think Africa is very positive about India's engagement. I think it is both regions and actually, in fact, individual countries in Africa could benefit from this relationship. But of course, certain things have to be in place. It's good to hear that the Prime Minister spoke about establishing a new framework for this relationship, because the engagement with Africa is primarily about its resources, and that's a good thing for the continent, because Africa is really on the margins of the global economy and is receiving less than 3% of global investment.
Well, let's put that point to Dr. Suresh Kumar in New Delhi. How important is Africa in sustaining India's booming economy and to secure its energy needs, if that's what it's about?
Yeah, India is working with Africa right from its independence 47 onwards, and now it is the time to strengthen the partnership between Africa and India. The economic partnership along with the political one, that will be the new progress achievement for the India.
Anthony Goldman in London, India says it's looking for credible partnerships in Africa and that it's not looking to exploit just oil and gas. Is that how you see it?
No, I think that there is an established relationship already. I mean, you can go to some parts of Nigeria and see the smaller three-wheeler Indian taxis are being used in some of the big cities in the north of Nigeria. There is an established trading relationship. India has a lot of goods that I think are appropriate to the African environment, and I think that in other areas as well, in terms of technology, as well as helping to build infrastructure in terms of power in some of the less well-developed parts of Africa, India also has a role. India has been involved in Africa in peacekeeping and security issues for a very long time. There are security issues around the Indian Ocean zone that I think also are important to both parties. But I think that probably the one thing that India does have to offer is to show Africa how it's possible to create an environment where you can have relatively strong economic growth and also have a representative, accountable system of government, a multi-party system that Africa has been struggling to accommodate. Africa tried a one-party system that was in some ways similar to the system of government they have in China. That didn't work very well in the 1970s and 1980s, but I think that it's perhaps in those, even in those political areas where India and a developing relationship with India could be of benefit on the African side as well.
Norma Grobbelaar in Johannesburg, South Africa accounts for something like 2/3 of Africa's total exports to India. I mean, what does South Africa gain from better engagement with India?
Well, for South Africa, India is basically a strategic partner. There's a very robust relationship with India. There's a very vibrant Indian community in South Africa, and there is a very strong historic relationship between South Africa and India. I believe in terms of looking at the potential for expanding, particularly the trading relationship, there's lots of new South African investments that's going into India. India is South Africa's 10th largest investor in this country. Particularly Tata is very involved in this economy. But I think there's also scope for broader cooperation. There's a scope for cooperation in UN Security Council reform, in global governance reform more broadly. We're talking about cooperation within the WTO context, on the reform of the IMF. And then, of course, India is a strategic partner with South Africa in IPSA, the India-Brazil South Africa Trialogue Forum, which really provides a platform for three democracies in the emerging South that are key players in their own regions to work together and to find ways to cooperate more on South-South cooperation.
OK, let's bring him back, Dr. Suresh Kumar there in New Delhi. Dr. Kumar, do you think India has any political agenda in trying to woo African nations? I mean, is there another agenda apart from the straight economics?
In the political agenda, you can say that democracy and multi-party system, it is already right from the beginning, India is supporting that. But in the political agenda, if somebody is mentioning the Security Council issue, it is not only the agenda. The more is the political agenda is that we are working for African countries for the sustainable democratic system. That is one of the agenda.
Well, let me put that point to Anthony Goldman in London. Anthony Goldman, I mean, does India have a political agenda? We know, for example, Delhi, as Dr. Suresh Kumar just said there, is looking for support in its bid to join the UN Security Council. So is there some political motive behind this, perhaps?
No, I think that there's a portfolio of overlapping interests. So it's not simply that India is looking for votes in New York at the United Nations. I think that there is a genuine strategic concern in India about the security of the Indian Ocean zone, and countries in Eastern and Southern Africa particularly have a role to play in that. And I think India has been, or the defence authorities in India have been keen to develop a relationship that goes back many years in terms of helping to train African military officers. And I think that there's also underpinning that a real strategic need for a partnership in areas such as energy. It's not just a question, I think, of oil and gas and access to minerals in like diamonds or gold. I think that the program of expansion of nuclear energy that India is putting forward requires sourcing significant imports of uranium from overseas, and I think that uranium is a potential source of imports from Africa for India. And I think that it's in those areas that I think that we can see all of these interests overlapping and coming together to create a genuine strategic need in India to build this relationship. And I think the smarter countries in Africa will look to exploit that and to try and drive as good a bargain as they can, use it as leverage, if you like, against some of those other international powers that are also looking for what has been a much more crowded space in Africa than perhaps has been the case for a generation.
Do African countries stand to gain a better understanding of just how to exploit their own resources with Indian help, do you think?
Well, I think there are a couple of examples in Nigeria where competition between India and other players has actually seen government agencies and in some instances private companies actually get much better deals, much more competitive deals. I think in some areas India is going to find it very difficult to compete with, say, the financial muscle of China and the full resources of the Chinese state, and perhaps in some of the more high-tech areas to be able to compete with some of the oil companies in the size of Chevron or ExxonMobil. But I think that in trading areas that I think India has already managed to make something of a market for itself, and I think it's there that that attention is going to be paid, and perhaps at that area where African governments are going to be able to see how far they can push things, perhaps to make a better deal for their people. In some instances, of course, there'll be other governments, maybe less representative governments, which might stand accused of using this relationship to help prop up an unrepresentative government, perhaps even what some would call a dictatorship.
OK, stay with us, won't you, because it's time for a short break now. But when we come back, can India really compete with China's growing influence in Africa? More on that. Stay with us.